Welcome to the fourth and final lecture for population. This is key issue 4 with the question, why do some regions face health threats? So of course, when we're looking through this stuff, we have to keep in mind that many factors vary geographically. Some regions have higher income, some regions have larger populations, some regions have smaller populations. Some regions have higher rates of education and greater access to resources. As you can see here, there is a great contrast to the level of medical resource that different communities around the world have, and that plays a role in the different stages that certain countries will be in. And of course, it is connected to what we recently went over, the demographic transition model. So let's jump in. Medical researchers have identified epidemiologic transition that focuses on distinctive causes of death in each stage of the demographic transition. Now, we have already seen how the demographic transition model can show us the economic and industrial level of a country in each particular stage. And in the same way, we can use it to understand or make judgment about the particular health problems that a country faces in each stage. Now, in the pursuit of combating these health problems, we have something called epidemiology. It's a branch of medical science concerned with the incidence, distribution, and control of diseases that are prevalent among a population at a given time. If you've seen The Walking Dead, which started out as a pretty decent show, I stopped watching it because it honestly got boring and wasn't going anywhere. But in the first few episodes, you hear them talking about the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. This is a United States federal agency under the Department of Health and Human Services. It's headquartered near Atlanta, and what they do is they try to prevent disease and control outbreaks and make sure that as few people as possible get affected by these diseases. So let's look at the epidemiological transition model. And like the demographic transition model, it purports that there are different stages a country goes through. And instead of looking at population levels, it looks at the type of health threats they're most likely to face. Now, stage 1 is characterized by pestilence and famine. Note in stage 1, people are also dying from all kinds of other accidents, attacks by animals, and of course attacks by other humans, because in stage 1 countries, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of war, and of course people are living in and around, not in and around, but around animals much more than in later stages where people are more urbanized. Now let's look at a particular case study, probably the most violent pestilent disease or epidemic, which is a spread of disease that takes over a whole society, is the Black Plague. Okay, so the Black Plague is what it historically was known as. Technically, this is the bubonic plague. It was probably transmitted to humans by fleas from migrating infected rats. Researchers have studied DNA from bones of people who had died from this, and even though for centuries people believed it was the rats themselves, modern science tells us that it was actually fleas that traveled on the rats. The plague reached Europe around 1348 to 1349 and killed at least 1/2 of the continent's population. Certain estimates say 1/3 to 2/3, but we can say probably at least half, which is just really insane. You'll notice in this graphic, which displays loosely the spread of the plague from the south up into the north of Europe, that there are a couple places, notably Milan and the Kingdom of Poland that were not hit as hard. Now, this graphic makes it look like they weren't hit at all. They were indeed affected, but not as worse or not as bad as everywhere else. In Poland, they actually were able to, under the King Casimir the Great, quarantine the Polish borders. So anyone that was affected, they pushed them out to the borders, and this basically held the plague off at the borders, which softened the disease's impact on Poland. Also, it is important to note that Poland had a relatively sparse population. And so, of course, this disease, like any disease, is going to spread from person to person, and the more tightly people are packed in together, the more likely they are to get the disease. Just like you're more likely to get a common cold when you go to school. Okay, you should still go to school, but with everybody, all these people in one place, we're more likely to get sick. Now, the original plague died out probably long ago, and you may wonder why it happened. So we don't know for certain, but evolutionary theory tells us that a pathogen that kills all its victims will eventually run out of victims, leading to its own extinction. So it may be possible that this particular strand of the bubonic plague killed too many people, and it was not able to then keep passing from person to person to person. So if the plague bacteria had been less virulent, less powerful, then it would have continued to survive. So the interesting thing here is that, just evolutionarily speaking, a bug, and we say bug, not an insect, but a virus, that doesn't kill its host is actually far more successful. I just mentioned the common cold, and the common cold is something we can't seem to beat. But the reason we can't beat it is because it doesn't kill us off, right? It spreads from one person to another. It annoys us. It makes us kind of miserable for a while. But unless your immune system is shot, it's not really a problem. Now, it is important to note that the bubonic plague does still exist, and some people do get it, usually in highland areas, usually along the latitudes, but fortunately it can be treated with antibiotics now. Oh, this picture here, this kind of creepy picture of the plague doctor, is kind of creepy to us now, but during the time these people were seen as heroes. So the plague doctor wore this strange beak-like mask, and it would be filled with perfume, fresh flowers, nice smelling things. And the reason was because they believed that the plague was transmitted through the air. So first they believed it was transmitted through the air, and then from rats, and then from rats through the air. And so the idea was, if you're getting near someone, obviously they smell terrible, and if you can block out that smell, then you are blocking out the disease. And so it's kind of creepy now, and you've probably seen movies or Halloween costumes where people are dressed up like this, but it goes back to this time when these people were actually hired to try to treat those infected, and it was a dangerous job. But the interesting thing is, the rest of the, I guess you could call it costume, it was really a uniform, wasn't really that bad at doing what it should have. It was leather, and by covering their whole body, they limited their exposure to the germs that these people who were affected by the plague carried, and decreased their likelihood of getting it. Alright, since we're talking about stage 1, and I mentioned in stage 1 people are likely to die from diseases, but also animal attacks, I thought this would be at least worth talking about. Now, this is a graphic that Bill Gates, who is a philanthropist, founder of Microsoft and the richest man in the world, he sent this out during Shark Week, and he said, you know, sharks are cool, but they're not even close to being the biggest killers in the world. We see the two biggest killers, the two deadliest creatures on the planet, based on the number of people killed per year, are mosquitoes and human beings. Human beings, of course, go to war, create havoc, murder each other, and create situations where each other cannot survive. But mosquitoes are the worst. And you know, mosquitoes are annoying to us, it seems, but in many parts of the world they carry deadly, deadly diseases. And so when we think about stage 1, people don't know this about diseases. People, about mosquitoes. They don't have mosquito nets. They don't have vaccines. And when we go down the list and look at these other animals, these are also a big concern. Snakes. Think about how many snakes you see on a daily basis. Probably not many because you live in the city. There might be snakes in your backyard. But think about people living in a stage 1 society. They don't have concrete everywhere. They don't have pest control companies. They haven't eradicated snakes from their life. Dogs are also a big killer. And you know, if we get bit by dogs today, we rush to the emergency room, we get a rabies vaccine, and we'll likely be okay. But think about in the past, and think about countries that would be in stage 1, or societies in stage 1. They don't have that vaccine. So we just need to understand that in stage 1 countries, people are dying from all kinds of things, from disease to attacks, whether it's from animals or humans. It is prevalent in the way, and death doesn't look like it does to most of us in this modern society, where you are going out relatively peacefully. At least the majority of people. It is the worst part of life. Of course, it's the worst part of life in general, but it is part of it. Let's go to stage 2. And stage 2 is marked by receding pandemics. So a pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, is a disease that occurs over a wide geographic area and affects a high proportion of the population. Something like the Black Plague, for instance. Now, these can be tempered by improved sanitation, nutrition, and medicine. And a lot of that came about during the Industrial Revolution. And this, of course, reduces the spread of these infectious diseases. So part of preventing a pandemic is, of course, or can be, of course, medicine, if you can treat the pandemic. But another big part of it is just preventing it from spreading. So, in the 19th century, many people believed that epidemic victims were being punished for sinful behavior. People always want to have an explanation for something, and sometimes the easiest explanation is that those people did something wrong. This in particular was the case during a cholera outbreak in a poor region of London in the 1800s. Enter John Snow. No, not that John Snow. There we go. Dr. John Snow. So Dr. John Snow disagreed with this, and he thought that there must be some other reason for these cholera deaths. And so he mapped the distribution of deaths in 1854 in this poor London neighborhood of Soho. Soho now is a trendy hipster neighborhood in London. He plotted them over a map of the distribution of water pumps, which was, of course, the source of water for drinking, cleaning, and cooking. He had this idea that it must be, or that it could be, that the water they were using was not safe. Here's this map. What he found was that a large percentage of cholera victims were clustered around one pump in particular, on Broad Street. This was considered the best pump and had the best water in the neighborhood. Tests proved that water at this pump was contaminated with sewage. So you have to understand, London was the biggest city in the world at this time, and they were basically living the same way that they would have lived out in rural areas, except they were all on top of each other. I'm going to link a video to the website of an author, Stephen Johnson, talking about a book that I read called The Ghost Map. And it's a great talk. It's only 10 minutes long, so I'd like you to watch it. And he explains just how horrible these conditions were that people were living in. But of course, they hadn't completely figured out why it was so bad to have open sewers, or why it was so bad to not get rid of their human waste in a proper way. So the construction of water and sewer systems eradicated cholera by the late 19th century. However, cholera reappeared a century later when growing cities of less developed countries moved to stage 2 of demographic transition. So we have cholera outbreaks even today in these less developed countries, where more and more people are living in close proximity to one another, and sewer systems are not always functional, or in some cases don't even exist. So you have human waste running down the street, contaminating the water that people are drinking. And when people don't have clean water, cholera becomes a possibility. And it's an awful disease. Let's go to stage 3. Degenerative and human-created diseases. So this is characterized by a decrease in deaths from infectious diseases, but an increase in chronic disorders associated with aging. So we have talked at length about how in more developed countries, people live longer. Okay, so the stage 3 countries that have gotten people to a point where they can live a pretty long life. They're not likely to get an infectious disease. You know, they're getting vaccines when they're children, so they are, for the most part, saved from these infectious diseases. They're not likely to get eaten by a lion. They're not likely to, not as likely to be killed in a civil war. They are less likely to get killed in a terrible accident because of safety procedures. Even something as simple as a seatbelt, right? And the law that you have to wear a seatbelt. You might not find that in a less developed country. But once people get to a certain age, they become more susceptible to other diseases. Okay? So we call these chronic disorders. The two important ones, two most common ones, are heart attacks and different forms of cancer. So again, it may not be so much that these disorders are necessarily more prevalent or inherent in a society. So it's not just because you're rich that you're going to get cancer. But if you're in a rich country, you're more likely to live long enough to actually get cancer. Okay, so it's kind of a weird thing where people in less developed countries don't get cancer very often, but it's not because they're more lucky. It's because they don't live long enough to get it. They die from something else. But then, of course, we have heart attacks. And in stage 3 countries and stage 4 countries, which we'll talk about in a minute, we do have human behavior that could lead to an increased risk for a heart attack. I mean, we have food like this, and this is obviously an extreme example, but we have food like this. We also have behaviors like smoking cigarettes, tobacco, too much alcohol that hurt our health. And so stage 3 countries, though they're more economically developed, they're certainly not immune to disease. But it's, again, those chronic diseases, those diseases that human beings, by their actions, promote in some cases, rather than pestilent disease, rather than disease that's spread from person to person to person. And then stage 4, you still have those lingering diseases like cancer, cardiovascular, so having to do with the heart diseases. You still have people eating foods that aren't good for them, eating too much food, diseases associated with obesity, right? Which you're usually not going to have in the poorest countries in the world because people don't have enough food to become obese. But the major degenerative causes of death aren't as likely in stage 4 countries to end someone's life prematurely. Life expectancy is extended through medical advances. So you might get cancer, but you're treated for it, and you might live many more years. And so in stage 4 countries like the United States, of course people still die, but they hang on to life longer. Here are the leading causes of death in the United States as of 2002. Heart disease is the number 1, cancer being the second one. So it's not until you get down to the 5th cause that people are dying from accidents. And, these causes are all, for the most part, things that, the top causes, I should say, are things that people can do little to prevent, which is telling us that most people in the United States are dying at an older age. Now, heart disease, you can definitely do things to take care of your heart better, and I suggest you start now while you're young. Build those good habits instead of trying to solve the problem once it's already a problem. Alright, this is the scary part. We've talked about stage 1 through 4, and just like stage 1 through 4 in the demographic transition model, we've actually seen countries go through all of those. Now stage 5 is a stage that we haven't reached yet, and so it's theoretical. So the possible stage 5 is the reemergence of infectious and parasitic diseases. Okay, this is where you get into some of your scary stuff like you may have seen in certain movies. Maybe not quite on a zombie level, but certainly to a point where you have an outbreak in a more developed country. Now there's 3 reasons why it might be happening. 1, evolution. Okay, diseases, germs, they also mutate. Antibiotics and genetic engineering contribute to the emergence of new strains of viruses and bacteria. Okay, meaning we might come up with an antibiotic that kills a germ, or we might come up with something that kills a particular bacteria, but those bacteria that do survive, they become stronger. So an example, in Sri Lanka in 1955, malaria was almost completely eradicated. They sprayed a chemical known as DDT in areas that were infested with mosquitoes that carried this parasite. But in 1963, malaria causes more than 1 million deaths worldwide because of an evolution of mosquitoes that are DDT resistant. So malaria, of course, is just an awful, awful chronic disease. If it's not killing you, it's making you too sick to work. So it's hurting a country's economy. I've been to a number of countries where malaria is a problem, and what I've learned there, so most recently in Ghana, is that it's just something that people have to live with. You're just going to get it at some point if you're living there, and the only thing you can do is treat it once you get it. There are antibacterial medicine that you can take to try to prevent it, but you can't live with those because those antibiotics will just tear you up. So maybe if you're going on a trip, you can take them for a short period of time. If you're going to be in a place that might have malaria, but it's not something you can take daily throughout your life, or it will hurt you very badly. So that's one possible thing, is that these new strains, these new viruses, they become powerful And the more antibiotics that we throw at them, the more powerful they get. Of course, poverty could be a factor in this. Tuberculosis, this is an example of an infectious disease that is largely controlled in the U.S. It's not much of a problem here, but it remains a major cause of death in less developed countries. Tuberculosis is airborne, and so it can spread throughout a country. So we might have these huge cities, people living in close proximity, but they're living in poverty where they don't have the kind of medical technology in order to prevent these things like tuberculosis. And improve travel. We're a more interconnected world than ever before. And so as people travel, they're carrying diseases with them and are exposed to the diseases of others. The most prominent example is H1N1, known as the swine flu. It was first identified in Mexico in 2009 and then spread throughout the world rapidly. So you might see people walking around in airports with masks on, and usually these are people from Asian countries, and they do this sometimes to prevent themselves from getting disease from others, but usually because they come up from a society where they feel like they are they owe the people around them a duty of not getting them sick. So when these people have a cold or have some kind of sickness, they will cover their mouths to prevent others from getting sick, which is pretty cool, and I appreciate it. Simple way you can do that: cover your mouth when you cough, and get a flu vaccine. You can get a flu vaccine for really cheap or probably free, almost certainly free. And the thing about that is, even though flu vaccine isn't promised to work, if you use it, and if everyone uses it, we have something called herd health, okay, which is the idea that if we've got all these people in one group and they're all a little bit less likely to get the disease, then that means that the whole group is a lot less likely to get it, because it's not going to be spread as much. So I'm a big proponent of everyone getting the flu shot. Of course, you need to talk to your parents about that. AIDS is the most lethal epidemic in recent years. Worldwide, 25 million people died of AIDS as of 2007, and 33 million were living with HIV. You know, HIV can be transmitted sexually, but it can also be transmitted through birth. So a woman who has HIV can pass that on to her kids. And so this is a disease that doesn't go away just with someone dying, because it can be passed through the generations. Problem with HIV, among other problems, is that it shuts down your immune system. It weakens your immune system. So like I said, people might get malaria and might not die from it in many cases. My wife had malaria 8 times when she lived in West Africa. Didn't die from it, but it definitely messed her up. So, but think about if your immune system is kaput, then it can kill you, and this is what happens in many cases. So look at how this is spatially distributed. It's a major problem in Southern Africa, and of course to a lesser but still very serious degree in the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Eastern Europe, particularly Russia. 90% of people living with HIV come from less developed countries. And we'll talk later on about development and economics, but think about how if you've got diseases being rampant throughout your society, how many people can actually go to work? How many people can actually, from a day-to-day basis, be expected to participate in a job? And so your economy is going to hurt because of this. And if your economy is hurting, then people are poor, and if people are poor, they can't get diseases. They cannot get medicine and medical treatment to treat these diseases. So in some ways, it's a bad loop of problems. And we will look at some of the solutions that many fine people are working on around the world to eradicate these things and at least prevent them from spreading. Okay, because remember, it is one thing to end a disease, to have some kind of miracle cure to fix it and eradicate it, but another more practical way, which is the model that Dr. John Snow left for us, is that if we can prevent it from spreading, eventually we will end it. And with 1/10 of the world's population, Sub-Saharan Africa had 2/3 of the world's total HIV positive population, 9/10 of the world's infected children. Okay. And then lastly, I just leave you with this map of tuberculosis death rate. Of course, it is spread throughout much of the world, where it's 50% and above out of 100,000, 50 people and above out of 100,000, not percent, in these countries in dark green. But as you see, so much of the world, aside from really Europe, North America, and a couple countries in North Africa, face this as a big problem. So tuberculosis is one of the big killers as far as a disease in the world today. So there's not really a way for me to end on a happy note, but there is a lot of stuff we will be looking at about how people are combating these diseases, and we really are living in a better time than ever before, where fewer people are dying from these infectious diseases. So it is a good time, but of course there's much work to be done, and there are ways that you and I can support that. So we'll talk about that in class if you're interested. All right, make sure you go back to anything you don't understand. Jot down any questions you have that you can ask me in class, and we will move on from there.